Okay. I'll get started here. I'm going to, let's see. I wonder if I shut off, I wish I could control. The lighting is so hot. See if, is this okay? Is that okay? Okay. Let me see how that looks. There. I don't know. I'll have to see. I don't know if that makes it any better. It certainly puts the, usually I don't have that. So now the spotlight is on me. The spotlight is definitely on me. So now I'm under pressure. Let's see. I'm going to I need to open this up, and I'm going to talk. What I'm going to do today, as I say, I've gone over the work I've asked you. And it became very clear to me as I went over the work that students are struggling with what I'm trying to get you to do. And what I found was very interesting about it, what I learned, it's very possible for students to, I asked you an individual question about, say, perfect competition. And I'll say, okay, perfect competition, and you can answer the question and say a certain thing about perfect competition, and somebody will say, and you'll write an answer and it's correct. But then what I've done is now what I wanted to do was ask you. What I wanted to do was ask you about. My glasses. I always forget something in the other class. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I forgot my glasses in the other class. The last week it was something else. It's like every week I forget something in the other class. So I don't have my glasses, but I'm okay. So what I wanted you to do was, I took you through steps from question 11 to 16. The idea was I wanted to take you step by step and get you to think about each of these markets and think about how to think about them, so then we could think about so you could make your own mathematical model and describe the markets. So the first thing I said was question 11. Please explain in your own words the difference between the following. So you have monopoly, natural monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. I think I spelled all that correctly. Very good. So then I said, explain the differences in terms of the number of firms in each market, the demand curve facing firms in each market, the level of profit experienced by firms in each market, the firm profit maximizing condition, and the difference between the market outcome and the outcome under perfect competition. So I said, okay, let's think about all of those. So it wasn't intended to be very difficult. All I wanted to say was, okay, how many firms in each market? So we've got monopoly, there's firms, firm number, what is 1? How many firms in the monopoly is 1? How many firms are there in a natural monopoly? And this is all I really wanted you to do. How many? 1. That's it, there's 1. There's only 1 firm in a natural monopoly. That's what it is. It's a monopoly. It's 1. That's why we call it, it's not 2. Some people wrote 2. It's 1. That's what a natural monopoly is, 1 firm. That's the point. If there's more than 1 firm, then it's an oligopoly. It's not a natural monopoly. Now, you notice we had the model, and the model showed, the purpose of my model was to show you in a game theory way how you end up with a natural monopoly. So the outcome was firm 1 drives firm 2 out and creates a natural monopoly. And that's because of the structure of that. We'll go over that in more detail. Competitive monopoly, monopolistic competition. How many firms? There are many. How many? Many. Many can be many. We don't know. There's no specific number of firms. Oligopoly, how many firms? Few. So there are few firms. Many, few. How many is few? As few as 2. So, and the point here, the natural monopoly, what happens if you can, if the second firm, if both firms survive in that game? What's not a natural monopoly, it's an oligopoly. It's a duopoly. So then you're talking about a duopoly competition. So that model, the purpose of that was to show you how you end up with a natural monopoly. So to playing a game, set in a situation, that's how you end up with a natural monopoly. So that's the number of firms. Few, and we don't really say it has to be at least 2. At least 2. But how many? Few. It's a few. And that's kind of, and Johan and I were talking before the class, there's a lot of things in economics are a bit of what we call hand-waving. You just kind of, there's a little bit of fuzziness. And that's just, some of it's unavoidable. Some of it we don't have, it's not like we have mathematical precision because we're talking about oligopoly. Well, how few is few? Well, we don't really know. I mean, there's no, you kind of get a sense that if there's a number of firms and they have each one of them has roughly the same percentage, and they seem to be competing in price and they're differentiated, well then you're talking about monopolistic competition. So that's one of the things you can see when we went over the oligopoly, is some of those industries start looking like monopolistic competition. You got an industry where it's fragmented, there's a few larger firms, but they're not very big. They don't have a very big percentage. And then there's lots of smaller firms that have less than 5% that don't appear. That's probably something close to monopolistic competition. Then you might say, well, it's kind of many. Few is that there's few enough, there's few enough firms that each of the firms are following each other. That all of the firms know their competitors. They know their competitors, they're aware of them, they follow them, they follow each other. That's what few is. It's few, and it's a small enough number that everybody knows who their competition is. If you don't know all your competition, then it's probably monopolistic competition or perfect competition, depending upon the nature of the industry. So that's the first thing. That's the number of firms. The demand curve facing firms in each market. Demand curve. What's the demand curve facing a firm in a monopoly? It's downward sloping. What's the demand curve facing a firm in a natural monopoly? Downward sloping. What's the demand curve facing a firm in monopolistic competition? Downward sloping. What's the demand curve facing a firms under oligopoly? Downward sloping. Now, one student noted that there's the kink. The kink demand curve. That's something that's a very that is something that is technically possible. I haven't talked about that. I'm just giving you a very general discussion on the overview of what goes on. And that answer was not incorrect, but basically the big picture is they're all downward sloping. They all and what does that say? They all have market power. They all have market power. Firms have market power under monopoly. Firms have market power under natural monopoly. Firms have market power under monopolistic competition. Firms have market power under oligopoly. So they're all downward sloping. That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted you to tell me. Downward sloping, downward sloping, downward sloping, downward sloping. That's it. So one, many, few, downward, 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 downward. That's it. That's all I wanted. Okay, the next thing is the level of profit experienced by firms in each market. Profit level, monopoly greater than or equal to 0. Could be 0, and that's economic profit. Remember, economic profit, we're talking about economic profit. It could just be 0, it's possible. But it has to be at least 0, but it's probably greater. But it could be 0. But it's at least, but it's greater than or equal to 0. Natural monopoly, greater than or equal to 0. Monopolistic competition, it could be greater than or equal to 0, but it's probably in the long run for most, typically equal to 0. But it could be greater than or equal. But typically, it tends towards that. Oligopoly, typically greater than or equal to 0. In oligopoly, natural monopoly, and monopoly, it's more likely to be greater than 0. In other words, that there is economic profit, above normal profit, but it could be 0. Monopolistic competition could be above normal, but it tends more to be 0. That's why we call it monopolistic competition, because there's an element of perfect competition. There's an element of perfect competition, and I'll explain. And as I say, one of the things about teaching this is that I really had to think about it and to say, how do I really explain what that means? And I realized I hadn't thought deeply enough about it myself to clearly explain it, and I think I'll try to make a very clear explanation as to exactly what's going on, what I think describes what monopolistic competition is. And as I said a little bit ago, the basic is that you're effectively doing price. You're doing what's the term I'm looking for? You're doing discrimination, price discrimination. So there's price discrimination that goes on in monopolistic competition, and the price discrimination is that firms are going and selling products that discriminate on the demand curve. But I'll explain what I mean by that. So that's it. That's the problem. That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted. All I was looking for on number 11. Let's see. The next thing is level of profit maximizing condition. What's the profit maximizing condition? Profit maximizing condition. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. 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 That's it. It's the same. They're all the same. Now, I'm doing that to say, not because I'm trying to trick you, but you realize, oh, look, they're all the same. Well, why does he ask me a silly question like that? I know the answer. Great. That's it. That's it. That's simply it. They're all the same condition. Just to get that, boom, get that in your mind. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. 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 It's all the same. What is it under perfect competition? Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. It's all the same. Any profit maximizing, no matter what market a firm faces, they have the same profit maximizing condition. They're making the same choice. Doesn't matter. Difference between the market outcome and the outcome under perfect competition. Difference is so the difference under monopoly is the difference of price and the difference of output. Price and output. Difference of price is it's less, and the difference of output is it's less. I'm sorry, it's greater. Price is greater. Price is higher. Output is less. Price is greater. Output is less. That's under monopoly. What about natural monopoly? Price is greater. output is less. What about monopolistic competition? Price is greater, output is less. What about oligopoly? Price is greater, output is less. That's it. They're all the same because they all market power. They all have market power. So the purpose here, well, I'm saying, well, all these conditions are kind of the same, but now you can see, well, now we have to see what creates, how do we end up with this outcome? So there are differences. But what we're saying is that here's all these things, they all have downward sloping demand curves, they all have pretty much the same profit condition, maybe monopolistic competition, more likely to be zero economic profit, the others more likely to be positive, but they all have the same kind of condition, they all maximize profits, the same, they all have higher prices and lower output, all of them, than under perfect competition. All of them the same. So what I want to do is to say, now you can understand there's a lot of similarities. We have only, in this chart, that's the one difference, is that. Other than that, they're all the same. So now we have to try to figure out, well, how do we really tell the difference? How do we, because we say that there's these different markets, but they're all kind of the same, except for this. But this is kind of the outcome. So you kind of say, well, the same, well, how do you get the difference? And that's what we want to do. But the first thing is, question 11, just wanting you to realize that, well, they're all the same. Most of the basic underlying conditions are the same. So now we want to figure out, well, what's different? What's different about each of these industries? I'm going to erase this. You have this, should be all, let me just see if that's all getting recorded. It's not, but that's okay. So it goes right to, the line goes right to there. Let me put that line up so I know. That's as far as the camera is seen, is right to there. I won't go that far anymore. We'll go there. Right? Okay. Now, let's see. Okay, I think that's fine. I'll go to question 12. Let me go to question 12. Oh boy. Yeah, I'm worried about my glasses now. Now I wanted you to do is say, write conditions, equations showing the total market demand for each of the following. Now we don't have oligopoly. Take out oligopoly. Remember on this list, oligopolies aren't on that list. The reason is that oligopolies is much more complicated to analyze. Analyzing oligopolies is complicated because you really get into a game theory. It's a game theory situation with oligopolies, and that's complicated. I've introduced very, very simple game theory stuff here because I think it's important for you to be exposed to what game theory is, see some very simple ways of thinking in a game theory way of thinking. But if you, and I've showed some models with oligopolies and some models that game theory, but game theory is complicated. So I don't ask you to do that, but we have perfect competition. And I'm going to ask you those four. And what I'm asking in question 12 is write equations showing the total market demand for each of the following. And what am I asking you to do? Make some stuff up. Just make something up for each one. Just total industry. You're going to make a total industry. So I could be anything. I could make and all I'm asking you is basically say, make some linear demand. And linear, it's simple. We're just at the early stages, no reason to make, unless you really want to make it more complex. But this is complex enough. because I want you to just get the underlying idea and to be able to put it in a simple mathematical form. And you say, well, why do I have to do, why the math? Why the math? It's just, I can just write this down and understand it. The thing with math, it gives us that discipline. It gives discipline, but it also, the fact is that we can describe reality. Mathematics does enable us to describe reality and to think about the way the real world works. We can describe, to some degree, human behavior in terms of mathematics and optimizing. Now, you also have behavioral economics, and personally, when I think about behavioral economics, I think what you're really talking about is more complex forms of behavior that you could still put in a I think you can still put it in a mathematical form. You just have to describe it. And behavioral economics has a little bit different. It's just more a more precise way to describe behavior. But again, I think that's beyond this class. We make certain assumptions here. This is a basic class in microeconomics, just to make sure behavior, the kind of assumptions that you make when you're looking at behavioral analysis, it's a little bit more complex. Do that in a separate class. So let's say we're going to write equations showing the total market demand for each of the following. In industry, let's say P equals 100 minus QX. That's a nice demand curve. Natural monopoly, I don't know, P equals, I could write 100 minus QX. I don't know. I'll write 200, 100, 125, doesn't matter. Just make something up. Oh, well, let's write 200. Just for something different. Monopolistic competition equals 300. The point is if I wrote 100 for each one, if I wrote the same curve, it'd be the same. It's no, fine. You just write the same, write different. You know, you want to do square, you know, if you really want that, you can do whatever, but I figure just have linear, it's just simple. It's very simple. Perfect competition, P equals 100 minus QX. That's all I'm asking for, just that. Just write down some linear equation, just something linear. As I say, you could have something that's that's a higher order function, but just keep it simple. And this kind of describes it. And these are all downward sloping. The important point is that each one of these, and this is what mathematically we've done, is we're taking down, all of these are mathematically downward sloping demand curves. They're all downward sloping. So that's the point. I say that the industry demand curve is downward sloping. Well, then write an equation that's downward sloping. Well, that's it. These are equations that are downward sloping. They meet that definition. That's it. That's all. That's all we're looking for. So just that. Okay. So we have our equations. Now, let's see what's next. So that's perfect competition. So that's all I've asked here. Just make something up. Just make up some numbers. As long as it satisfies the condition of downward sloping demand curve. And those do. Those are all downward sloping. That's 11. I'm sorry, that's 12. So that's all I asked you to do in 12. Still haven't really asked you to do much work yet. We're still not asking you to do much work. Now we're setting the problem up. So the first thing, go to 11, just make your definitions. The definitions we're seeing they're all the same. Now at 12, just make up some demand curves. And actually now we're seeing it's still all the same. So we're trying, so when do we get the separation? And that's the purpose of this exercise, is you can just see all these things that are the same, and then when it starts, you start breaking out and start defining what the differences are. And how we define what the differences are and the conditions that create these different markets and these different outcomes. So write equations showing the portion of the total market demand served by a single firm in each of the following. Well, monopoly, single firm is 100 minus QX. It's a monopoly. It's a total market. That's just it. It's the same equation. That's why it's a monopoly. What about the natural monopoly? 200 minus QX, the same equation. Perfect competition. Well, what you're talking about, let me put that in terms of, let me restate that in terms of QX. So QX equals 100 minus PX. Well, here we have many firms. In fact, in both monopolistic and perfect competition, we have many firms. Many and many. What's many? It's a number. What's a number? N. N is a number. There's some N that's equal to many. So divided by N. Divide both sides by N. That's the single firm. That's going to be a large number. That's large number, small total output relative to the total market. That's it. Now, monopolistic competition is a bit more complicated. And let me now, let's see where this, let's see. Let me erase all of this. She'll wake up later to, that's the nice thing about it, at least people can take naps. I'm going to erase all this. I'm going to explain what, and this is one of the things that I had to, and as I say, you really, when you teach, it really forces you to understand what you're talking about. And students ask good questions. They, let me think about that. Maybe I don't really understand it as well as I think I do. And that's the reality. The reality is that teaching, you're actually forced to, you say, okay, well, I've had all these concepts, I've babbled all this stuff, but let me really, oh, maybe I never really thought about that clearly and deeply. And so, but that's, as I say, that's all I'm looking for. It's just, that's in terms of equations for a single firm. That's it. That's it. Let me write down, okay, let me take, great thing is we've got, I can make straight lines, kind of, do my best. You know, with these lines on the board, I can actually kind of make a straight line, but I still can't quite. So we have the industry demand curve 300 minus QX. Okay, P equals 300 minus QX. 300. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's 50. 250. 200. 50. 100. 50. 0. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. 50, 150, 200, 50, 300. Okay. All right, 300. Okay, PX, QX. Good. All right, now we've got our, that's monopolistic competition. That's not marginal cost, monopolistic competition. Don't get it confused. Point here, and we draw a line. We try to draw a straight line. Wow. It's about as straight a line as I think I never can draw. Wow. You know, not bad. I'm even impressed with myself. My daughter wouldn't be, but she's an artist, so. Okay, so that's our industry demand curve. And you know what? I had to think about this. Well, what You know, as I was thinking about all of this, I'm thinking, okay, how do we describe what's going on with monopolistic competition? And you know what's interesting is that I really had to think about what's going on here. You know, and then it got me to thinking back. I talked about the handbag. Think about the handbag example. You got handbags are handbags. As I said, you know, you got a bag. You can make it out of this material. You can make it out of you know, leather and diamonds, whatever kind of stuff. But you put stuff in it, so they all look the same. They all do the same thing. And so when you're talking about perfect competition or monopolistic competition, this is, let's say, handbags. That's the product handbags. I'm not saying what kind of handbag, just handbags. Something that you carry, it's a bag, and you put it in. I guess a handbag could be as anything, even a plastic bag would qualify. You know, the one that I get at my OK supermarket store for 6 yen, I guess in a pinch that qualifies as a handbag. It's kind of way down there. And way at the other end, some handbag that you can buy at Gucci or a Louis Vuitton that has diamonds and whatever that costs more than a Ferrari. You know, there's somebody to buy that. So we're talking about, we've got a market where there's people that want to buy something down there, something up here. And we're talking about just a total industry. Okay. So what we're really talking about are segments. We're talking about segments of the market. Let's see if we can do, oh, look at that, we got just one blue one here. Now we're going to try to, what we're going to do, let's say that we can segment this market into 6 pieces. Okay, let me take a big risk here, and I'm going to run that. Here we go. We use the blue there, and then let's use pink there, and let's use white here, and let's use blue again here, and let's use yellow. What's yellow? I think that's fine. We have one pink, one white. Oh, anyway. That's fine. High-end handbags. Low-end handbags. Low-end. High. Segments. That's what I thought about. You know, that's kind of what's going on. That's what's going on. And why does a firm in a monopolistic competition face a downward demand curve? Because they're occupying some segment on the demand curve, and they can have enough of a chunk of that segment that for them, in other words, they're getting such, and that's where we're getting this, like it's similar to price discrimination, because you could say, well, here's the demand for handbags. And let's say that the market is so small that any of these segments are too small, but it's big enough to support, say, some handbag makers. Then they're going to end up producing some kind of average product. But if the market is large enough, then you get enough firms, and we kind of get this the market is segmented. So we can segment this, and now we can say, okay, well, what's the demand for high-end handbags? Well, it's like this. Let's see what we do it there. High-end handbags, just as an example, erase all this. High-end handbags, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Now, 300, 290, 280, 270, 260, 250. That's yellow. Let's use the yellow so it's consistent. And that is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. That's the segment. So now we've got a segment, high-end handbags. Okay, so now monopolistic competition, we got high-end handbags. Now we're just looking at the high-end handbag market. It's that slice of the market. So then we're looking, you could have a firm that kind of has a monopoly in the high end. So if they have they can have a monopoly or a bit of a monopoly in that segment. And it depends on how wide or small the segment is. So the more defined it is, the more that you're likely to have a monopoly in that segment. So even you could say there's a firm operating in that segment and it has a monopoly, but they are competing with other. They're limited. They are limited because other firms are facing the same. For the next segment, the second high end, let's draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got enough room. So it looks like this. And there. And there. It's again 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. In that segment, but now it's 250, 240, 230, 220, 210, 200. And now we use blue. And that's that market segment. Okay, that's what we're talking about. That's what monopolistic competition is. And we're basically looking at the market can segment, which also you can see that effectively what we're doing is the firms are, because it's essentially price discrimination across all the industry. That's why we can say we're kind of getting price discrimination across the industry, because the high end, then you have the Louis Vuitton that can make high-end handbags, and they can price it and get that price. If somebody wants to go and pay that, they actually want to pay that to have that much money just to have something to carry stuff around in that actually probably at the end they can't afford to put anything other than the same cheap stuff that everybody else is putting in their handbags, but at least it looks good. But that's the important thing. So that's that end. And then the next end, and the next end going down. So you can see, you can see that at every segment you can have a monopoly. So essentially now what you have to say is that then what you have to talk about is, when you're talking about an equation, this is where it gets complicated for monopolistic competition. So what I'm basically telling you is it's a bit complicated, and you kind of have to make some stuff up. But we could say, I don't know, there's still many. There's some M firms. See that, and again, it's not an oligopoly. So within each segment, there's still, it's relatively free entry. There's a relative free entry because it's competitive, so there's relatively low cost of entry, but you can segment the market. You've got, so that the firms are facing downward sloping demand, each firm, and in fact, you can get more of a firm subdivision. This could be, I don't know, that could be Gucci, that could be Louis Vuitton, that could be Prada, you know, so whatever, you know, it could be something like that. Or it could be that they're all kind of competing, or it's all of them are competing in the whole segment. So it depends on how fine it is. Either way, the point is that even if you're occupying this small segment, you're still competing with other nearby segments. So you're differentiating yourself, and you can price discriminate, but you're still competing. You're still competing with other segments nearby. So I suppose you could either say, you know, you could either say, so here would be 300. That's P of segment 1 equals 300 minus Q of segment 1, but in the range of 0 to 50. Yeah. So there's some range. So you could say, you know, there could be, let's just say there's M firms. And again, so it would be, what's your equation for that? Say there's M firms in there, so it's Q in segment 1 equals 300 minus PX, P1, and then the number of firms. This could describe one possible way to describe a single firm. Or you could just say, to get it fine enough, and say that there's a single firm which has a monopoly, and there's one firm, and that it occupies that little segment of the demand curve. You could do either one. I think you could do either one. Either one would work. So that's a way to think about what monopolistic competition is. As I say, that this is one of those things where, let me just get this here. As I say, it really, in putting this kind of thing together, I realize, oh, okay, well this is the way you need to think about it. Is that, and that you really are able to segment the monopolistic competition means that you can get market segmentation, you can get some degree of price discrimination. The firms can price discriminate because people, they can, well, somebody wants to pay that much for a handbag, well, doggone it, somebody's going to go, instead of just making all the same handbag and have a market here, they make a handbag that satisfies that market. So this satisfies that particular, that very narrow market segment. So that's where, when you can make that kind of price, that discrimination, you can discriminate in the product, and that's where the monopolistic competition comes from. The example of the Aoyama Festival. And how many people went? Did anybody else other than Eddie go? Did any of you go? No, no, no. You went. Speak up. He's very quiet and very. Do you have this?
No.
Okay. She bought it. I bought it. I bought it. I was thinking. I went and I was thinking about it. The reason why, and maybe what I'll do, I'm probably going to give you something on. I've got the extra credit, so you know. The great thing about this, and if you had this, but I'll have to try to get either a copy of some way. This is really wonderful stuff here. This is really wonderful. I love this kind of stuff you get in this country. There's this kind of organization that it's fantastic. Check this out, folks. This is shows you the location of booths, where the booths are located, the product, and the price. Shows all of it. So you can see the different products, the different prices, where they're on, where they're at, and and as I noticed, and I was able to ask Eddie, because when I went to her booth, the price was $450, and I checked here, it said $400. And that's an interesting thing, is that, and so she found, and the answer was that it turned out that their their costs were higher. It turned out their costs were higher, and they had to, in order to make a profit that justified, the effort they were putting into it, they had to raise the price to $4.50. So I thought that was quite interesting. It was a very interesting case where your input prices turned out to be higher than you expected. As I say, I'm going to have to see somewhere I get to scan this so that you can get this. Would it be easy for you to scan these pages? Is that possible?
Yeah.
I mean, I can get that done. I don't think I can do that at home, but I know my wife can do it at her office. So if either you can do it or let me see if I can do it. If you can do it, why don't you try doing that, and I'll try to get it to make sure that we get somebody that gets this, because I am going to put, well, two things. One, I would like to give you an opportunity to do the extra credit. 2 of you went, so you're, as I say, but 2 of you didn't, so I do want to give you the opportunity to at least think about this problem, because it is, it's all here, it's right here, it's all here. It's great information. This tells you the location of the booze, the product, and the price. You can see, you can figure out how many of each product was sold, for how much, whether they were competing by price or location. You know, you could do quite a great study. And as I say, I was very impressed in going to it. As a great example of monopolistic competition. Yeah, it's that's the kind of thing going on. So that's kind of, and this is a bit complicated. So I'm not, you try to keep that as simple as possible and just say, well, we got some segment. I think the best way to say it is we got some segment, and let's assume there's one firm that's operating in that segment. There's one firm that's operating, so how are they going to price? What is their operating price in order to maximize their profits? I think that would be the way to do it, and that's the way I'll do it here. Is and let me write that down. I'm going to write that down. That's my segment for perfect monopolistic competition. CP1 equals 300 minus QX, and QX in the range of 0 to 50. Q1, and let's just say there's a single firm. So there's one firm, so that takes care of that problem. So that's what we're going to use. Somebody wrote down what I used for the other markets? So I'll have to ask that, because I've already forgotten what those other equations were. Now we'll go to question 14. Calculate the marginal revenue. Now this is where I wanted to see if you could figure out what to do here. And I think most people got really tripped up here. So this is where, now I can see, this is where people, by this point, if you've gotten this far, and not everybody did, this is where most people got tripped up here as to what to do. And this is where I want you to see what you need to do here, because marginal revenue, now we have to think about, in calculus terms, we have to bring that into the equation here. And if you can, I'm going to erase all this, and it is recorded. So we have a record of that. I think it sees that far high. I'm going to erase all of this, and if somebody can remind me what this is. Let me check the time. 13. We're fine. 35 minutes. Okay. Let's see. Let's start with industry operating under perfect competition. What was the equation? Can somebody tell me the equation? Did anybody write that down? The equation for perfect competition. I think 100. What did I write?
100 minus.
Okay, use the equation for a single firm. 100 minus px. So I have no which one. Put it back. So 100 minus px, that's for minus px, qx equals 100 minus px, so we have divided by n, that's some n, so let's just say, anyway, let's just think about the, I don't want to make this too. Let me just keep this. Let me not worry about that right now. We can worry about the number, but let's say let's work on this. So this is qx. So that's qx equals 100 minus px. Well, what's revenue? You have to remember what's the definition of revenue. Revenue is the amount of money that you take in. Well, revenue. What's revenue for good x? Well, that's your price times the quantity. X times qx. Simple enough. Price times quantity. What you charge for it, and how much you sell. That's your revenue. It's not hard. Well, this is the quantity. That, and that's the price, so we can substitute. That is equal to px times 100 minus q, times 100 minus px. The revenue is, so that's 100 px minus px squared. That's revenue. That's your revenue. That's your revenue statement. That's what I get. This is what you have to keep clear in your mind. You have to keep clear in your mind. That's revenue. So you have to take your definition of revenue. You've had the definition. It's very simple. This is not rocket science. And just substitute that. You have your quantity. You can put that in terms of price. We want one variable so that we can to see how the change in revenue is with the change in one of the variables, and here we're going to do it with price. And what's the change in revenue with the change of one of a variable? What is that? Marginal revenue. That's what marginal revenue is. That's marginal revenue. That's it. That is marginal revenue. So we have marginal revenue, and we can do that with px, we can do that with qx. Actually, we can do it with qx. Let's see. Actually, it's more appropriate. I'm sorry, I do need, in fact, now let me change that because it should be qx. Let me take the px, and the reason why is because, in fact, the way I set that up, you don't have to change that, but it's qx times 100 minus qx, qx. Equation there's no change, qx squared. Now the reason we're doing that is because remember, under perfect competition, the firm is a price taker. So we have to figure out how the firm can vary its output. What's marginal revenue in terms of output? Then so it's but the thing is, well wait a minute, because now whoa. Wait a minute, we're talking about perfect competition. Well, the firm's a price hit. What am I going through all this for? And see, now you can see that it's pretty easy to get. You kind of start making a mistake here because what's the definition of perfect competition? The firm's a price taker. So its marginal revenue is just simply the price. Marginal revenue equals the price. So in fact, if we since the price is fixed, your price is fixed. The only thing you can vary is the output. Then your marginal revenue is simply the price. at that in terms, because basically what it means is since the price is fixed, oh, I see, that's a constant, right? That's just a constant. So it's what I should have done was said my marginal revenue is some constant times QX. So it's a constant, some constant, it's a price taker, it's a constant, it's just some, whatever is out there, but it's a constant. So since it's a constant, then what we do is we take the derivative of the change in the revenue with the change in quantity. But how does our revenue change with quantity? When it's C times QX, what's the derivative of that? This times the derivative of that, the derivative of that's 1. The derivative of QX, let me just write it here, derivative of QX equals, that's 1, so 1 times QX times 1 minus 1, that's equal to 1 times QX of 0 equals 1. That's the derivative. So it's C times 1. Times 1 equal to C. That's the marginal revenue. That's why it's flat. That's why with the calculus, do you follow that? Do you understand what I'm doing? Okay. That's very simple. That's why you have a linear, mathematically, why you have a linear demand, marginal revenue curve, because you have a linear revenue curve. That the firm under perfect competition faces a linear revenue curve. So what I was doing, I was going through all that, but that's for a firm facing downward sloping demand curve. This firm faces a linear revenue curve. So the marginal revenue is just the constant, which is the price. The marginal revenue is the price. So that's the definition. That mathematically shows it. We take the derivative and we just get C. So that's why when it's flat, when we say that the marginal revenue is flat, that's why. It's PX. It's because our revenue curve is linear, and the revenue doesn't. The revenue varies with the price. So so as our quantity changes, then our revenue changes by the same unit. That's all. That's what goes on with perfect competition. So that is for single firm in. Let's see. Marginal revenue for a single firm in a perfect competition under monopoly. Then the monopoly. Marginal revenue. Now we get, let's see. Now we're going to show under monopoly. Now we can use this equation under monopoly. It's PX equals 100 minus QX. Let's see. QX revenue X QX revenue X equals revenue of X equals. Okay, so now we have, this is the revenue function that faces the firm with the monopoly. It's also be the firm under, we're going to change the numbers because I've got a different demand curve, but it's going to be the same for the firm under natural monopoly and essentially under monopolistic competition, at least in the segment that it's operating. Whatever segment it's operating in, it's going to be similar type of equation. So our revenue, so this is the revenue, say, of a monopolist. It varies, let's say 100 QX, what was the monopoly? What was the number that I used? I just want to make sure they're the same. Do you have that written down? What was the equation that I had for monopoly?
200 minus.
200?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll use 200. All right. There you go, I'll use 200. Did you use 100 or 200?
The natural monopoly is 100.
I mean, it doesn't matter. Like I say, you just make all these numbers. I could use 3,746. You know, it doesn't matter. You know, but I just want to be consistent. So if you go back to your notes and say, wait a minute, he didn't do the same. He did it differently. What's going on? Oh my God, I don't understand it. So I know. So we do have to be consistent. So that's why I'm trying to make sure I'm consistent here. And that's reasonable because when you're trying to get all this stuff straight, I have to make sure that I'm explaining it in a way that when you go back, it makes sense. So here is the firm under monopoly. 200 qx minus qx squared. Well, how does the firm, what's the marginal revenue? Marginal revenue is the change in revenue with the change in quantity. That's the first derivative. That's how does the revenue change with the change in quantity. That's our use of calculus. That's what marginal is. The change in the revenue with the change in the quantity. That's equal to the marginal revenue. That's the marginal revenue. That's what we mean when we say marginal revenue. That's mathematically what we mean. So we can take that derivative, and what is that derivative? The derivative of the revenue with respect to the quantity. That's that's this times the derivative of that. That's 1. Qx, the derivative of qx is 1. So that is equal to 200 minus derivative of this of qx squared is 2 qx 2 minus 1. Is it 1? 2 minus 1 is 1. Take that out. That's the marginal revenue. That's the marginal revenue. That's it. That's the marginal revenue. So qx is 0, the marginal revenue is 200. Qx is 1, marginal revenue is 198. Qx is 2, marginal revenue is 196. That's how you calculate at every point, the instantaneous change in the marginal revenue. And that's what calculus does. It tells us at each point exactly what the change in the revenue is. And that's why we use calculus, because it's precise. That's why we get exactly. Whereas if we make tables, that's why it's not correct. That's why it never comes out right. Because we need to get the instantaneous change. This tells us the instantaneous change in the revenue. The instantaneous change in the revenue with the change in quantity. That's the marginal revenue. Okay. So hopefully that's starting to make some sense. So that's for monopoly. And what's for natural monopoly? What was the number I used for natural monopoly? 100? 200? 200, same? Well, it's just the same. Whatever it is, that's the same equation for natural monopoly. There's one firm. That's it. This one firm. Let's say we've got some market segment. Let's say for monopolistic competition, for marginal revenue. Let's do that. Let's say, and again we're taking some market segment there. Let's say that firm is, it is the only, just to make it simple, let's just say there's one firm in that segment. It's still monopolistic competition because there could be more firms that enter that space and squeeze it. Let's just, for simple, let's just say that there is, just to make it simple, because at any rate, the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. So no matter how many firms enter that space, it faces, those firms have a downward sloping demand curve. Always have a downward sloping demand curve. They may get the competition may squeeze out their excess profits, but they still always have a downward sloping demand curve. So this is under monopolistic competition, and it's P1 equals 300 minus Q1 in the range 0 to 50, And so that we have to remember that range, because that's the limit in that space. So we the revenue is revenue for segment 1 equals to the price of 1 times the quantity of 1, and that's equal to the revenue of 1 equals to let's see, 300 minus Q1 times Q1, that's equal to 300 Q1 minus Q1 squared. You see how while we do this linear, it just keeps it real simple. All the equations look the same. They're all the same. And just whatever number, the only difference is just this number. So it keeps it simple. Just keep it simple. Then our revenue 1. So the change in revenue with the change in quantity for 1 equals to 300 minus 2Q1, and that's equal to the marginal revenue. That's the marginal revenue. Okay, so now we've got making equations. So that's 13. We've made all of those equations. So that's 13. Now marginal cost. Now this is where marginal cost is where we're talking about where we can begin separating out what these differences are. So I'm going to erase all that. The marginal cost, and again, what I'm saying is that I want you to just make up some numbers. Just make up some numbers. That's all. Just make up numbers. Marginal cost for single firm operating firm in an industry operating in perfect competition. Marginal cost equals marginal cost equals marginal cost equals QX. Some QX over 2. That's right. So and what does that do? That gives us some. That gives an upward sloping marginal cost curve. Okay. Now the thing about the upward sloping marginal cost curve is, this is when people made a mistake here. Keep this. This is why you've got to keep all these things clear in your mind. That's the supply curve. That's what you have to understand, is that the marginal cost curve is the supply curve. That's the marginal cost curve. Now I'm going to put the supply curve, just it's the same thing. That's the supply curve. Marginal cost curve is the supply curve. It's the willingness of the firm to supply each unit of output. So QX. It's QX, the willingness of the firm to supply a unit of output at each price, whatever the price is. And since it's firm under perfect competition, it's a price taker, so it's going to set its output, marginal cost equals marginal revenue. It's just going to be one point. So that's why when we model it, we talk about an upward sloping marginal cost curve. The reason is that, and I saw some people put 0 marginal cost. Well, that's okay, but the problem with the 0 marginal cost is that means that the only way you can have a 0, if your marginal cost is 0 under perfect competition, then the market price must be 0. Then there's going to be firms that are going to enter the market until you're at that point on the demand curve, and the price is in. That's the only and since everybody's marginal cost is, if you make that assumption, then the prices must be 0. And what's your revenue? 0. So it's not a very interesting problem. I mean, it's possible, but most people won't get. Most people won't get out of bed to produce a product whose price is 0. But that's it. But so be careful. And that's the thing, right? Some people, go back and see what you wrote. If you wrote that your marginal cost is 0 under perfect competition, go back and check your answer. Oh, okay, well then you're saying the price must be 0. It has to be 0, because marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Because your marginal revenue, the only way that you would produce is if your marginal cost is 0. If your marginal cost is 0, then if your marginal revenue is 0, the only way you would do it, or if your marginal cost is 0, then the only way you would produce would have to be then firms are going to enter the market until the price is 0. So your marginal cost equals marginal revenue. It's 0. That's it. So keep that. That's what you have to keep in mind. That's why we have an upward sloping. That's why when you're describing the perfect competition, you want to talk about an upward sloping marginal cost curve. That's why we have a upward sloping marginal cost curve. So I'm hoping that what I'm doing in this lecture is I'm really helping you to coalesce in your mind, excuse me, help you to coalesce in your mind what all these things mean. Okay. So chalk dust is allergic, a bit of allergic. At any rate, so that's why we do this. So now you can understand, well, that's why we model it this way. Is that if you have if your marginal cost is 0, then your price is 0. So in order to get a model that produces, where the firms are producing some positive costs, you've got to have some kind of upward sloping marginal cost curve. And again, the upward sloping marginal cost curve is the supply curve. Very, very important to remember that. Upward sloping, the slope or the marginal cost curve is the supply curve. That's why it's the supply curve. It's an important thing to remember. And I'm not saying that when I was your age I understood that, so I don't, but if you can understand that at a much younger age than I did, well, then you're ahead of me. Now, so in perfect competition, monopoly. A monopoly, you can put it up as sloping market. Again, you just make a number up. Okay. Now, with the perfect competition, I'll want to see an upward sloping marginal cost curve, because otherwise you get some nonsense result. You know, it's a result that really doesn't make much sense. So, upward sloping marginal cost curve. Now, for a monopoly, we could have flat marginal cost curve, upward slope, whatever. You make anything, and again, we can make it up. We could use marginal cost could be 2x, so let's say qx over 4. We can make it 0. We have a model. The point is, it doesn't really matter. whatever we would use, we'd be able to calculate something. You want to make this a more interesting problem, and to see how your behavior changes with the change in marginal cost, then have an upward sloping marginal cost curve. That's great. It's fine. You can have a flat marginal cost curve. You could have a 0 marginal cost curve. That's your choice. All of these will give the same. The only thing that would vary would be the behavior of the firm compared with what the marginal cost curve is, but it doesn't change the ultimate choice of the firm. It doesn't affect, the firm is still going to maximize and make some choices. It's going to be a little bit different if the marginal cost is some upward sloping marginal cost curve, or if it's like flat marginal cost curve, or flat, that is some positive number, marginal cost equals some value, say 3, or your marginal cost equals 0. Any one of those are fine. Use any of them, whichever one. You want to make your problem more interesting, more stimulating, then use something upward sloping. That's it. Then you can play around with it and see how an upward sloping marginal cost curve affects your outcome for your output for a firm operating in a monopoly. Yeah, that's it. And that's how you start exploring those kinds of things. So you can see that when you begin to get enough understanding what these models are, then you can begin to use the models to explore the behavior of the firm under certain conditions. And that's what we do. We think about how the behavior of the firm changes under certain conditions. So you can say, how does the firm behavior change under upward sloping marginal cost curve? And you can look at how does the firm behavior change under, then you can look at input cost. We haven't talked about input costs, because that's a monopsonist. Well, that's too complicated right now. I just want you, you guys just to learn, just to understand all of this. Just get all this down. They can worry about making more complexity. If you can handle more complexity individually now, great. But I don't think most of you are there yet. And so, as I say, now you can see, I want to wait another week. I want you to go back, and I really want you to go back over this lecture, go back over what you did, what you wrote down, or what you struggled with, what maybe you couldn't understand. Go back and see what I've done here and begin to understand what I'm trying to get at here, and trying to get you to understand and think about. Let's see, we got monopoly, natural monopoly, monopolistic competition. Well, let's do the monopolistic competition. Well, natural monopoly is the same thing. It's just, it's the same. Now, monopolistic competition, again, what we're doing here, again, if there's a natural monopoly, it's the thing, oh, I know, I'm sorry, let me take that back. Let me do, see, the thing about a natural monopoly, and here's what I would want you to do, is, I mean, it's still a monopoly, but a natural monopoly, now you have the fixed cost. You have some high fixed cost, which is high, and a marginal cost that's low. So low value. So we could have a fixed cost, marginal cost, we could make marginal cost equal 0. Marginal cost is 1, some low value, it doesn't matter. Here's you're gonna have, it's gonna be relatively flat and relatively small. You make 1, 2, whatever, small number, that would be, and to note that you have a fixed cost. But again, the only thing that fixed cost does is it explains your profit, and it explains the amount of it explains the willingness of the firm to enter the market. So remember we had that question? I asked you to say, okay, in fact, maybe this is now very useful to go over this, because they said, what? I asked you the question, I said, if you have the, at what price, given that 400, let's see, it was, is it 400 minus QX? PX equals 400, yeah, PX equals 400 minus QX, oh no, 40. Yeah, I said 400, I think I said 400. So, oh no, 40, right, it was 40, I'm sorry, 40. 40 minus QX. So that's P111, Q11, okay. So 40 minus QX, and I said, okay, what is the fixed cost that the firm will choose not to enter the market? What's the fixed cost? This is very important. This is, I want you to learn how to think. Throw a problem like this at you, and I want you to think, okay, he's talking about the fixed cost. So the fixed cost, and let's say that we got a marginal cost of 0, marginal cost equals 0, just to eliminate that as the problem. We're just worried about the fixed cost. Check and make sure, I got enough time, people. 7 minutes, good, we have enough time to get through this. Because this is important. I want you to get real clear. Some of you just didn't have this clear in your mind at all. Okay? This is very important. Price, this is the demand curve facing that firm in round 1. What's the fixed cost where they wouldn't bother to enter the market? What is that price? One person said it's greater than 75. That's correct. It's correct, but it was incomplete. And the reason is that, and we'll get to this in a moment, but let's say we had the fixed cost of equal 75, that was for one condition, but I said, well, what's the fixed cost where they wouldn't even bother to enter the market? Well, we know that the revenue equals to price times quantity, the price 1 times quantity, that's equal around 1, and that is 40 minus QX times QX, and that's 40 QX minus QX squared. That is 40, your marginal, your revenue equals 40, I'm sorry, your marginal revenue, then your change in the revenue with the change of QX for that revenue, that's for revenue 1, that is equal to 40 minus 2 QX. Notice how all these are the same. Notice all these, that's the reason why I do these linear. So you just don't get caught up in the shape of the function. It's real simple. Even if you don't really know calculus, you can do this. You know, even if you haven't really understood calculus, at least this is actually get a understanding of what calculus is. It's not, because calculus is just about margins. What happens on the margin? That's what calculus is. That's what we're always talking about. Economists talk about the margin. That's why we use calculus, because we want to figure out what's going on in the margin. This tells us what's going on in the margin. That is the marginal revenue. Equals 40 minus 2QX. So we set, we have marginal cost to 0. We don't worry about that. So we maximize 40 equals 2QX. QX equals 20. That's our maximum. We know then, put 20, P, then our optimal P is 20. So it's 20 times 20 is 400. That's how we got that. That's where the 400 came from. Well, if that's our revenue, that's our revenue. So our revenue in round 1, our revenue equals, down here, revenue equals, in round 1 equals 400. Well, if our revenue is 400, what's the fixed cost that we wouldn't enter the market? What's the fixed cost? If the revenue is 400, what fixed cost would we say? And if we have, our marginal cost is 0. If our marginal cost is 0, that's why we make it 0. We just eliminate that. We don't think about that. What's the fixed cost? What's the fixed cost? 75. If the fixed cost is 75, then our profit is 325, because that's what we had in the example. So if our fixed, what kind of fixed cost would have to be? Well, you just look at it and see. It's got to be greater than 400. It's a fixed cost. So if the fixed cost is greater than 400, greater than 400, firm doesn't enter the market. That's it. That's the answer. That's the answer. Firm, it has to be greater than 400. See that? Go back. If you struggle with this, go back and look at this over and over again till you get this. This is very important. This is clear thinking. That's what I want to teach you, is to think clearly. So, and I know one of the things when you're learning, it's really hard because you see something and you panic. Oh, how do I think about this? How do I think about it? That's why I tell you, go back, write down the definitions. Make sure your definitions are clear. You understand clearly how to think about this. You have your right here. This is your price. You face this demand curve. What's your behavior? Well, What's your behavior, your output? You maximize your revenue. How do you maximize that? You find your marginal revenue, you maximize your output, and that tells you your revenue. So then that tells you what the fixed cost. It has to be less than that. And if it's more than that, what that tells you is the market's cost too much to enter the market. That's what it means. So no firm can enter the market if it's greater than 400. That's what it means. That's it. So that's what I'm looking for there. That's just to tell me, and that's where I want you to learn to think clearly. When you get these problems, write down your definitions, set your problem up, make sure that you understand all the important parameters, what's important, what matters. Make sure you write all of that down. Get into that habit, writing that down. Step back, don't panic, don't just start writing and hoping that that at random the right answer comes out. It might, sometimes it does. But step back and think clearly. That's what I'm trying to teach you how to do, is to learn how to think clearly about these things. So, and I really recommend, this is going to be an important part of the midterm. What I'm going to be looking for in the midterm is what I've talked about in this lecture. I want you to be able to take this thinking and to be able to do it yourself. And when you can do it yourself, then you show me that you really do understand it. And as I say, and the important thing for me was when these exercises, and I haven't sent you the your scores. I'll figure that out, but I'm not. The most important thing now, rather than get you to worry about what you got in your score that you got on that portion, I want you to worry about thinking clearly. And so this will definitely be, the midterm will be about these markets and to see that you understand these concepts. And if you do, I assure you, when you go to your next classes, in the rest of your studies here, you're going to walk in that class and then, oh, okay, they get it. So that's the opportunity here, is for you to get that. So we'll close at that. That's exactly what I wanted to cover in the lecture today. I think this is the first time I've ever done a lecture here where I just use the blackboard. So so please, I'll put that up. I'll definitely, let me make sure it's still recording. I apologize. The last week I had too much stuff on the memory. I didn't realize. I thought I had erased it. It turns out I didn't have enough memory. So I'll definitely make sure that you get this online. I'll put this up early tomorrow. And that's what I'll want you to do. I will want you to spend the next week going over this. And if you have questions, I really want you to contact me. If there's anything about this lecture you didn't understand, it's not clear, please contact me. It's very important. I'm going to delay it a week. Spend the next week going over this lecture. Watch it how many times you need. Ask me questions about what's not clear. Thanks.